Okay, everyone, shall we make a start? So, welcome to this Hive seminar on REF2021 and equalities in the research community. And myself and Claire are going to be talking on this topic today. We're each going to make a few opening comments, and then we'll open it up for a discussion, which hopefully will be a very interesting one. So, just to introduce myself first. So my name is Dominic Dean, and I'm the REF Academic and Operational Manager within Research and Enterprise Services. Work very closely with Gordon Harold, who is the Deputy Pro-Vice Chancellor for the REF at Sussex. And joined today by Claire Langhammer. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Dom. So I'm the Drake Director of Research in Harp, and I'm a historian. I work on 20th century British history.
Thanks. And you're also a REF.
And I'm also one. I'll talk about that in a bit.
Okay. So the way that we're going to do it today is I'm going to go first and give an overview of the relationship between REF2021 and equalities, both in terms of what Research England, which is the government body that runs the REF, require, and the views from the community that they're responding to, and then also a little bit on what we're doing specifically within Sussex as well. And then Claire is going to give some insights, some comments from your experiences. So to get things started, so this is mostly going to be fairly factual to begin with. If I do make some comments that are more kind of analysis or opinion, if you just take it that unless I specifically say otherwise, I'm expressing that as a personal view rather than as the university's position. But most of it to begin with, at least, will be just running through the facts. So, sorry, the laptop seems to have frozen. There we go. So for anyone who isn't already aware, the REF stands for the Research Excellence Framework, and it is the UK's national exercise of research assessment. And its primary role is to determine the distribution of core research funding to universities, which is known as quality-related or QR funding. It's a peer review-based exercise conducted by panels. Panels are split on a disciplinary basis. Each panel is made up by a majority of academics, although there are some non-academic research users on the panels as well. And the outcomes of the exercise are the distribution of that QR funding, as I mentioned. So the amount of funding that each university gets is proportionate to the quality of their submission as it's judged by those panels. But then also the reputational effects that we get from the result of the exercise. And in fact, for Sussex and for many other universities who are in a similar position, the reputational effects are considered to be more important than the direct funding that we get, because those have an effect on student and staff recruitment and on our general research reputation. REF assesses three key elements of a submission. Those are outputs, impact, and environment. Most of the grade, 60%, is made up of our output submission. And in this context, outputs means primarily academic publications, peer-reviewed publications, although it can also include other types of research output, such as patents and technologies, and exhibitions and performances, in areas where that is relevant to the discipline. Second element is the impact, and in this context this means the non-academic impact of our research, so the changes and benefits that research undertaken at Sussex has created in the world beyond Sussex, but also beyond higher education in general. And that's assessed through a series of case studies which are effectively narratives of particular instances where our research has had such effects. Third section is environment, worth 15%, and that means the research environment, all of the human and technical and physical infrastructure that makes up a research environment, through from pieces of kit and equipment and to things like postgraduate mentoring, seminar series, and so on. Really everything. Some key dates for our REF submission. We have a census date of the 31st of July 2020. And what that means is that the content of our submission is largely dictated by who we have employed at Sussex on that date, and I'll say a bit more detail about that in a moment. And then we make the submission itself in November of 2020. The submission is then reviewed by those panels during 2021. And all of the material that we submit, whether it's outputs, impact or environment, is graded on a 1 to 4 star scale, with 4 star representing the most internationally excellent material. I'm running through this fairly fast, but obviously we can come back to any element of it in Q&A, and I just want to give you the background before we get into the equalities aspect specifically. So, whose work is eligible for the REF? So for the outputs section, this would be outputs who are produced by individuals who, since January 2014, either are employed on the census date, 31st of July 2020, to undertake research, or have been employed to undertake research at Sussex at some point during that period since January 2014. They have to hold significant responsibility for research. This is a new bit of terminology that has been introduced specifically for REF2021. We can say a bit more in a moment about what that means. They have to work as an independent researcher, and come back to that in a moment as well. And they have to either be employed on 31st of July or have been employed during the period on a contract of at least 0.2 FTE. There are a few things that are new for the REF in 2021 as opposed to previous instances of the REF and the RAE, which was the equivalent exercise that it replaced. Probably the biggest single change is that we are required to submit 100% of our eligible staff who have significant responsibility for research. So you might be aware that in previous instances, the REF, before the RAE, was a selective exercise where universities could choose whose work they wish to submit and could leave individuals and groups out of that submission if they chose to do so. Now there's a change of policy, and 100% of people who are on an eligible contract and have significant responsibility for research have to be included in the submission. The number of outputs per person has changed a bit, and the 2 points are related. They're connected, the point about 100% of submission and the change in the number of outputs per person. So for REF 2021, we have to submit between 1 and 5 outputs per person. In the last REF, it was a standard 4 outputs per person. That was a fairly rigid requirement, unless there were particular individual circumstances where you could apply to get that change. But it was normally a fairly rigid requirement of 4 outputs. So we have much greater flexibility to choose which outputs for any particular person we're going to include this time. So you can see that flexibility for university managements has been kind of taken away to some extent by the 100% submission rule, but then it's been given back in a different form on the flexibility of submitting between 1 and 5 outputs per person, which of course means that if one individual is a particularly stellar researcher and has produced 5 outputs that we think are likely to be 4-star in the panel's judgment, then we can submit all 5 of those outputs. And if someone else, for whatever reason, perhaps they've had individual circumstances, or perhaps their role has involved more concentrating on teaching or other parts of the academic portfolio, and they only have 1 strong research output, then we only need to put that 1 in, and there's no penalty for that. When individuals move between institutions, both their previous and their current employing institution can submit an output produced at the first institution during the period. So what that means is, say someone was employed here from January 2014 until middle of 2016, and then they moved to the University of Birmingham. So we at Sussex could still submit in our REF submission anything that they produced during the period while they were here employed, even though they're not employed anymore on the census date. And Birmingham could submit anything that they had produced at Birmingham, but it could also submit anything that they'd produced at Sussex during the period. So there's, if you like, there's more flexibility retrospectively than prospectively. And another key change is that our impact case studies are worth much more in terms of the proportion of the outcome than they were in REF 2014. One question that often gets asked is whether early career researchers are eligible for the REF and whether they meet the criteria that I've just set out. So this depends on whether the individual is considered an independent researcher, which in REF terms means someone who has responsibility for the design and direction of the research, and it would not include someone who was undertaking work solely under the direction of another PI, as postdocs tend to do in certain disciplines in particular. So a classic example of someone who is independent would be someone who held an externally funded fellowship in their own name for their own project that they are directing, and they would definitely count as an independent researcher. However, it doesn't quite only mean those people. So even if someone doesn't have such an externally funded fellowship, but they are, through whatever structure, working on a research project or number of projects where they are effectively acting as the PI, they are leading the design and direction of the work, then they would count as independent. So you can see from that in terms of eligibility for the REF, for early career researchers, it can sometimes be a little bit more grey than for people who are later in their career and on standard contracts. One point that's worth mentioning, though, is that all research staff at the university, and indeed postgraduate researchers too, also contribute to the REF submission in a slightly less direct way. And what that means is that for our outputs, whilst every output that we include in the submission has to be associated with someone who is REF eligible, who meets the core criteria, of course, in many areas, outputs are very often multi-authored. And so that might well be an output that someone else, either a postdoc or a postgraduate researcher, has also contributed to as an author, and clearly they are then contributing to the REF submission, even though they're not in the sort of core staff list. Similarly, of course, research staff and postgraduate researchers might contribute on development of an impact case study, and they also will all certainly contribute to the research environment by virtue of being here, doing their research and the various activities that they might do, whether that's hosting conferences, running seminars, or whatever that might be. So to come to the core point of today's session, it might be just worth saying why the REF has an equalities dimension to it, because that might not be necessarily obvious. So there are a few reasons why this is the case. One of this is around representativeness of the submission. And I should be clear on that any REF submission is always tailored by whichever university is submitting it, and of course Sussex is no different, to represent what is estimated internally to be the best possible material in terms of how the panel are likely to score it. Only material that is 3-star or 4-star weighted gets any funding as a result of it in the funding formula. And within that formula, there's much more weighting towards 4-star material than 3-star. And of course, we only have to submit a minimum of 1 output per person. So you can see from all of those factors that this is very much weighted towards the highest quality material. It's weighted towards trying to put in what we think is our best material, hence the name, the Research Excellence Framework. However, of course, what is considered to be the most excellent material is not always a straightforward or transparent judgment, or not an uncomplicated judgment, certainly. And probably everyone in the room will know that there are many debates in the sector around unequal norms that we have within the higher education sector, so particularly pronounced in particular disciplines and fields, and that there is a risk of unconscious bias, possibly other kinds of bias as well as unconscious. There's a risk of unconscious bias in the way that excellence is judged, and thus in the way that material is selected for the REF. So that is something that we should be aware of when making our submission, and indeed there are some quite hard structures to force us to be aware of that. And one of those is the requirement to have and to implement a code of practice. So the code of practice is the governance document that sets out how we will run our REF preparations in a fair and transparent way. This is something that Research England require us to have. The one at Sussex, and indeed every other university, is currently under development, and we're required to submit that to Research England by the 7th of June this year. They will then review it and see whether they think it meets their criteria and whether they think it's good enough, and we will hear about that in the autumn. And the Code of Practice makes various demands on us in terms of how we try to mitigate for possible effects of unconscious bias or other kinds of bias or inequalities in the way that we conduct our preparations. Also, within the environment section of the REF in the submission itself, we are required to explain our measures to protect and promote equalities and diversity as part of the research environment. We'll be required to talk about initiatives in that area and how far they're successful. And the REF also has an equalities dimension, and this is where we get onto quite a sensitive topic, because it has a perceived impact on individual careers and on staff issues as a whole within higher education. Now, I should be clear on this, that Research England do not want it to have an impact on individual careers or on the way that research units are staffed or the way that staff are managed within those units. The REF is supposed to be a judgment of research units and collectively, therefore, of research institutions. The results of the exercise are never released at individual level, so we never find out what any individual output or indeed impact case study got in terms of its quality score. So there is no quality score that applies specifically to that author, or not one that ever gets released. We only get the cumulative scores for the submitting unit. So it's not supposed to be an individually focused exercise, but there are perceptions that it is, or certainly has been in the past, and I don't know, Claire may or may not want to pick up on aspects of that. So given those things, there are some initiatives that are intended to protect and promote equalities within the REF nationally. So the introduction of greater flexibility in output submission, so the ability to choose between 1 and 5 outputs to submit per person, is in itself supposed to help promote equalities, because whereas before there was a kind of perception that everyone had to have 4 outputs to submit unless there were very particular circumstances. So therefore, if an individual hadn't met that threshold, there was a perception that they were somehow not good enough, or that was the perception in certain quarters at least. And obviously that is quite an unflexible position to have, because we know that there are mixtures of responsibilities and portfolios within academic careers, even where individuals are all on the same contract. It sometimes happens that some people have a particularly active and dynamic and kind of high-level research agenda, and others are much more focused on teaching or something else, maybe a management responsibility within the institution that they have. So, Research England's position for REF2021 is to say, right, we'll give you much more flexibility, and therefore there won't be the sense that every individual has to produce 4 outputs, or otherwise they've not met the bar. They only have to produce 1 as a minimum. There's the requirement to have the Code of Practice, which I've talked about. We're required to have equalities and diversity training for individuals who make decisions on the content of the REF submission within the institution. We are required, and this is still true notwithstanding the greater flexibility in output submission, have a mechanism by which individuals who have had significant individual circumstances that have constrained their ability to produce work as normal during the period will be able to declare that. And that can range from anything from relatively conventional circumstances like maternity leave right through to much more severe and unusual circumstances that have affected someone's working life. There is nationally an Equalities and Diversity panel for the REF that sits as a core part of the process. And Research England have themselves an explicit aim that they have communicated to universities in quite draconian terms that they want to challenge the culture of making a link between REF submission and effects on individuals in individual careers. So some steps that we're taking specifically at Sussex. So we have to have our code of practice, as I mentioned, and we are currently, provisionally, expecting to take an inclusive view of eligibility in that code of practice. And what that means is that, as I mentioned, there's a requirement to submit 100% of staff who have significant responsibility for research. Universities are free to either say everyone who's on a standard teaching and research contract has such significant responsibility for research, and we're going to take that position, or they can say, actually, we have a standard teaching and research contract, but not everyone has significant responsibility for research, and we'll look for other evidence, which might be to do with workload models, to prove who has significant responsibility for research and who does not. Now, Sussex is provisionally expecting to take the position, and I emphasise that it is still provisional at the moment, that 100% of our staff who are on standard teaching and research contracts will be considered automatically to have significant responsibility for research. Hence, describe that as an inclusive approach to eligibility. We're looking to have transparency in process. We're going to do equality impact assessments to look at the composition of our submission as it's developing, to see how that maps out as an equalities profile and whether there is evidence of bias, whether there are issues that we need to revisit in that. We're going to have our training for decision makers, as I mentioned, as Research England require us to have, and we've got our individual circumstances declaration process that is due to be opening from around about mid-autumn of 2019 for individuals to start making those declarations. And that's the end of my overview for now. I'm aware I've covered a lot of material there. Obviously, all of it we can come back to in the Q&A, but I think it might be really helpful if within that framework Claire now makes her comments.
Okay, thanks, Dom. Yeah, people can communicate with you while I'm speaking. When Dom asked if I'd talk about REF and equalities, I was a bit sort of, I'm committed to equalities, or I hope I am, and I'm contracted to be interested in REF. But it was interesting for me to think about putting them together in an explicit way, in a way to be communicated. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk really from my disciplinary perspective, and I'll hopefully in the discussion we can pull out some of the differences around different units of assessment. And I'm also going to draw a little bit on my experience of being on the REF panel. So I was on the history REF panel as an output assessor in 2014. I joined the panel towards the end of the cycle in 2013, and this time I'm on the panel again, joining it again once the criteria setting section of the panel has kind of passed. And I was sort of thinking back to my experiences of REF 2014. I think one of the most striking things for me was that the REF panel seemed to take equalities far more seriously than many universities seem to take equalities in the run-up to REF. I think, and I absolutely understand this, I think that there is a lot of criticism of REF and for what it's done to universities. But I think that actually sometimes we blame REF for things that actually aren't necessarily what REF is doing, and more about what universities doing in their interpretation of REF. Of course, this would never happen at Sussex because of Dom, who I trust implicitly on everything to do with REF. But talking to my history friends in other institutions, a sometimes inept and sometimes malevolent interpretation of REF rules, or the use of REF to actually pursue different agendas. In fact, in writing the environment statements for the last REF, units of assessment were explicitly asked to evidence their support for equality and diversity. And this fed into the assessments of the research environment. And the history sub-panel report, which our panel put together in the aftermath of REF, emphasised that they took these guidelines extremely seriously. The report also emphasised that the panel was quite disappointed in what it found, and I thought it would be useful just to quote from that report, because I think within it gives us a sense of the kind of strategies that we need to be thinking about. It said, a significant number of submissions did not demonstrate fully satisfactory working practices, particularly with regard to the treatment of early career staff, including lighter workloads, post-early career staff development, regular study leave with transparent procedures, and equality and diversity. Brackets, units that discuss gender often did not address other forms of diversity. So I think it's important when we talk about REF and equalities that we're clear whether we're talking about actual REF or whether we're talking about REF preparation. In some ways, REF can actually be driving positive change within the sector. That said, there were issues. The history panel, like many other panels, was a remarkably white panel. There was a significant imbalance in terms of gender. 17 men, 8 females, and amongst the output assessors there were 9 men and 5 women. And this was broadly in keeping with RE 2008. And indeed across REF 14, panels did not have a representative proportion of female members, members of some minority ethnic groups, and of disabled people. Indeed, the Equality and Diversity Advisory Panel noted in its own report on REF 2014 that it was, quote, disappointed that little progress was made on recruiting panels from underrepresented groups. But in REF 2014, it wasn't just about the panels, it was also about what was submitted. Women aged 30 to 50 were less likely than any other group to be returned to REF 14. And, at least in history, the Royal Historical Society found gender bias in the authorship of history impact case studies too. So it's to be hoped that things this time round will be different. And academia is often a complex combination of hope and disappointment. On the hope side, it does seem that REF is improving representativeness on its panels for REF 21. On the history panel, for example, there is absolute gender parity at both criteria setting and assessment phases, and a small move towards ethnic diversity on the panel too. And REF documentation has, as Dom's outlined, made it really, really clear that it wants us to be proactive in our approach to equalities in the research environment section of the submission. That we should be using this section of the submission to promote equality and diversity. And that this should also infuse our selection of individual pieces of work and in thinking about those processes for selection. Moreover, of course, the Equalities Act of 2010 means the university has a series of legal obligations beyond REF that feed into it. So moving beyond history, the panel report, so history is part of panel D, the panel report on REF 2014 itself summarised how units of assessment had responded to equality and diversity. And I think it's worth quoting this at length because it can give us a sense of the concrete actions that REF was looking for last time round and that we might think about in our preparations for 21, but also just in terms of our preparations for a better research environment. And I'll come back to the question of whether a more equal research environment is a more excellent one later on. So what did the panel say? Panel D report said, Submissions were specifically asked to address equality and diversity issues in the staffing strategy and staff development section of their template. But, and here comes the disappointment, this point was not always addressed, or little information was provided on proactive initiatives in this area. And this was taken into account in determining the appropriate grade for this section of the template. Support for equality and diversity was evidenced in those submissions which, for example, delineated training programmes that improve awareness of these issues, that outlined links to institutional equality plans or objectives, support for part-time working, recognition of time constraints when scheduling meetings, the presence of support networks, development workshops and mentoring schemes for staff in minority categories, concrete information on staff changes, promotion of staff in minority categories, and structures of support for staff with caring responsibilities. And I think it's quite easy to say, yes, we want a more equal research environment, but actually creating a more equal research environment comes down to particular mechanisms and practices. And I think we can usefully mine the panel reports from last time round to see what each panel was looking for, not in an attempt necessarily to second guess what panels are going to say this time, but simply to give us some ideas about how we might do positive, good equalities and diversity work in our own areas. So what are the key areas that have been picked up on as of concern in terms of equality and diversity for the coming REF? Well, Dom's already listed some of them. Staff eligibility, how that question of significant responsibility for research and research independence will be determined, the question of individual circumstances and how they'll be treated, internal processes for output selection, panel recruitment, I've already mentioned, and also the use of metrics in some areas. So I thought in the second part of the talk, what I'd do is just say a little bit about if we take as read that we want to create a more equal research environment above and beyond our legal requirements, then how do we actually go about doing that? And in what I want to say, I'm drawing upon a series of reports that the Royal Historical Society, which is kind of the most influential scholarly society in my discipline, have produced over recent years on equalities in the discipline. I'm not for a minute suggesting that the challenges in history can be generalised out to the challenges elsewhere. But I thought they might offer at least a starting point in an area that I know a little bit about. So the reports are two reports on gender equality in UK history, one produced in 2015 and one in 2018, and a third report on race, ethnicity and equality in UK history, which was also released in 2018 and has been quite widely discussed among history departments across the country. Now, a theme in all three reports is the ways in which different kinds of inequalities intersect and reinforce each other in framing the experiences of individuals. Although the RHS has focused on gender and focused on race and ethnicity, the reports are clear that this is a starting point for thinking about other manifestations of inequality and for thinking about being proactive in generating an equal research culture. And I thought I'd just pull out some key areas that we might think with in perhaps reflecting on our own experiences and our own areas, and also in thinking about what we can actually do to improve things. So the first thing I want to talk about is people. Because inequalities are often seen most starkly in the makeup of departments and in their shaping through promotion, through contractual status, and through promotions practices. And the REF in environment, we have to talk about our people and our people strategy. So drawing on the Royal Historical Society research, I kind of thought, well, what can we do about this? And they suggest, really, these are things that we all know, and that the university knows, and that departments knows, Drakes know, but often we need a push to implement them. So interrogating our recruitment and selection practices, providing meaningful training in equalities legislation and good practice, which might go beyond doing an online training module in our lunch breaks, ensuring that our recruitment panels have done that training, making sure that we don't embed pay inequalities right at the start of careers by allowing some people to negotiate on salaries and preventing others from doing so, and providing support for all promotions applications so that we can show that arc of support over a career when we're talking about our research strategies and support for colleagues. And having structures of mentoring that work, that have resource of time attached to them, so that people can actually feel supported as they pass through the academic life cycle, and other people can gain experience in mentoring people through that. The second area that the RHS identified is resource, of course. Unequal access to resource, time as well as money, which can reinforce pre-existing inequalities, whether in relation to research support funding. So an early career researcher might suffer disproportionately from a cut in research support income, for example. Or whether it's simply in relation to the time available for us to research when workloads seem to be ever expanding. For example, a colleague returning from maternity leave might find herself particularly squeezed in this context. What can we do? Well, the RHS suggests that we need to think about how we actively support staff returning from maternity, and that we might actually put that in our environment documents as evidence of a commitment to equality, that we provide support for faculty with caring responsibilities, that there is transparency in workload allocation models, and that all work is included, including the emotional labour that lots of academics spend a lot of time performing, and that there is fair distribution of research support money. The last area that I wanted to say something about is representation, really. And again, this feeds into the kind of information that will go into the environment document that units of assessment will produce for REF. That document that actually surveys, represents, gives that sense of the life of a department or area. Inequalities are often particularly apparent in the events that we organise and attend as part of our research lives. Male-only panels have become quite newsworthy in recent times, or manels, it's a horrible word, but they have gained a lot of attention. But there are other questions around representation and equality in terms of who gets to speak, who gets to be selected as a keynote, the accessibility of events, and also their timing. The appointment of journal editors and referees feeds into equalities on the REF, not least because of questions about who gets to publish their work. The ability of ECRs in particular to have people to write for them, for promotion, but also for grant applications, feeds into their ability to contribute to REF. And of course, citation practices also feed into equality in REF, particularly if citation is wrongly seen as a proxy for quality. And there's now some quite interesting work being done on who gets to be cited in work and who doesn't get to be cited in work And frankly, I've lost track of the amount of times I've sat in papers listening to and it often is, it just happens to be the case, male academic talking about an exciting new area that they're doing research in and quoting lots of other male academics, male historians, when you sit there knowing that there are actually a lot of other people who've been doing this work that aren't being cited. So what does the Royal Historical Society suggest we do? Well, that we have a responsibility in creating our own research cultures to address this. That we ask who's speaking at conferences before we end up being either the token woman or the only BME speaker at a conference, that horrible sinking feeling when you realise, oh, that's why they asked me. And that when we organise our own events, we think about putting equalities at the centre of our organising, proactively, which we can then feed into our discussion of research culture in the environment statement. That we think about the importance of peer support alongside cross-career stage mentoring. That we are, particularly at the early stages of our careers, proactive in asking other people to read our work so that we can develop a bank of referees who might write for us when we apply for grants or apply for promotion. And that we all push for representativeness in approaches to editorships, advisory boards, peer review colleges, and that if we are editors ourselves, that we monitor the relationship between submission and acceptance with an equalities eye on. Okay. So to just say, to bring this to a close. So one of the things on the flyer was this question: is a more equal research environment also a more excellent research environment? And instinctively, the answer to that is yeah, of course. But we can't just assert that. We can't just assert that this is what we want. In terms of REF, we actually have to evidence the mechanisms that we've put in place to create this, to show our workings in many ways. And I think personally one place that I might start is by interrogating my own unconscious bias about issues of research excellence. And crucially, what research excellence looks like, rather than who it looks like. In the run-up to the last REF, I had a lot of conversations about, and it became a shorthand, about there being 4-star researchers. You know, some people are always producing 4-star research. That's who they are. Their essence is to be a 4-star researcher. And they're people who will just create endless and production line of 4-star research. What being on the history panel showed me was that actually this was a myth. There are very few people who are always producing 4-star research. That actually a lot of 4-star research was built on 2-star research or 3-star research because of that process. The process across the life cycle of a career and also the process across the life cycle of a project. And I think it's that really, because I think equalities issues often feed into that perception of academic excellence at the university and departmental level. So yes, a research culture that is more equal should be more excellent, but we might also want to think about how we ourselves identify excellence in the first place. Okay.